The bear had a scar above its left eye. I noticed it before I noticed anything else, before the automatic doors finished sliding open, before the cold air rushed in and killed the heat in the produce section, before anyone in aisle 3 had time to understand what was standing at the entrance. A pale crescent of bare skin cutting through the white fur just above the brow, catching the fluorescent light like something that had been placed there deliberately. I didn't know what it meant then. I wouldn't understand it until much later, when everything had already changed. That morning I had made a decision. I had folded the resignation letter, slid it into my jacket pocket, and driven to work for what I had already decided would be the last time. 14 years in Longyearbyen. 14 winters watching the light disappear for months at a time, and I had finally run out of reasons to stay. The letter was still in my pocket when the bear walked in, and I remember thinking, even in that first impossible second, that the universe has a strange sense of timing. I need to tell you something before I describe what happened next, because otherwise none of it will make sense. I have worked in that store since I was 23 years old, and I have seen every kind of human behavior this island produces. Drunk tourists, screaming children, a man who once tried to return a frozen salmon he had kept for 2 weeks. But I had never, not once in all those years, felt the quality of silence that filled the building the moment 600 pounds of polar bear stepped through our automatic doors and stopped, completely still at the entrance. I still don't fully understand why none of us ran, and when I finally understood the reason, it cost me something I hadn't expected to lose. The morning had started the way last mornings often do, with a particular kind of quiet that feels different from ordinary quiet. I had parked in the same spot I always used, the one near the cart return where the asphalt is cracked, and a single tuft of grass pushes through every summer. The Arctic sky above Longyearbyen was the flat gray of old pewter, low clouds sitting heavy over the fjord, the mountains across the water dark and close. I paused outside the entrance a moment longer than usual, looking at those mountains, trying to memorize something I couldn't name, and then I pushed the door open and went in to start what I was certain would be my last shift. By 9:47 in the morning, we had restocked the dairy section, and I was halfway through the frozen goods when I heard the doors open. The sound itself was ordinary, the soft mechanical sigh of automatic glass parting. What was not ordinary was the cold that followed it, not the usual breath of outside air that dissipates in seconds, but a sustained cold, the kind that doesn't apologize, the kind that moves with something large behind it. I looked up from the freezer case, and the first thing I saw was the size. The second thing I saw was the scar. The bear stood at the entrance for 3, maybe 4 seconds without moving. Its head was low and slightly tilted, the way a dog tilts its head when it hears a sound you cannot hear. The fluorescent light caught the pale crescent above its left eye, and it glowed against the white fur, like a parenthesis around something important. I would later learn from wildlife officials that this scar was years old, and that it was how local researchers had been tracking this particular animal across the archipelago for a long time. In that moment, I knew none of that. In that moment, I only knew that something was looking at the store, the way you look at a place you have been before. No one screamed. That is the part that still surprises me when I tell this story, because screaming would have been the rational response, and we are, I had always believed, rational people. A woman near the bread display took 2 slow steps backward without taking her eyes off the door. A teenager near the refrigerated drinks simply stopped moving, one hand still extended toward the glass case. I was gripping the edge of a freezer shelf so hard my knuckles had gone white, and the resignation letter in my jacket pocket was suddenly the least important piece of paper in the world. The bear lowered its head slightly, as though deciding something, and then it began to walk forward. I had lived in Svalbard long enough to know that polar bears are not curiosities. They are the reason we carry rifles when we leave town, the reason every trailhead has warning signs, the reason the first page of every employee handbook I had ever received contained a protocol that began with the words, "In the event of a polar bear encounter, do not run, do not make sudden movements, do not provoke." I had read those words so many times they had stopped meaning anything at all, until that morning when I found myself standing in aisle 4 with no weapon, nowhere to run, and 600 pounds of Arctic predator walking purposefully through my front door. The handbook, for once in its bureaucratic life, had given genuinely useful advice. I did not run, and that is how I ended up close enough to watch what the bear did next. It did not lumber. That is the first thing I need you to understand, because every image you have ever seen of a polar bear moving on land suggests a kind of slow, rolling heaviness, a mass negotiating gravity, not commanding it. This bear walked the way a surgeon moves through a room, deliberate, unhurried, aware of every surface without needing to look at it. Each paw found the floor with a precision that made no sound worth mentioning, and the silence that surrounded those footsteps was so complete, it felt like the store itself had decided to hold its breath. I counted 9 people in the building when the bear entered. I know this because I have replayed the moment so many times in the months since that I can now account for everyone. Their positions, their postures, the specific way each of them stopped being whatever they had been a second before. Marte, who managed the registers, was standing at the customer service counter with a phone in her hand. She did not put it down. She did not dial anything. She simply stopped in the middle of whatever she had been doing and became a person watching a bear. The teenager near the drinks case had let his arm fall back to his side without retrieving anything. A man in a red jacket near the back wall had turned so slowly it was almost geological. None of us ran. None of us made a sound. And it would take me a long time afterward to understand that our stillness was not the paralysis of fear. It was something else entirely, something I don't have a clean word for in any language. The bear moved past the produce display without pausing. It turned its head once toward the stacked oranges, a brief and seemingly dismissive evaluation, and then continued forward with the same unhurried certainty. I noticed the scar again as it passed under one of the main ceiling lights, that pale crescent above the left eye catching the fluorescent glare, and something about the angle made it look almost like a small moon, suspended just above the brow. I pressed myself flat against the freezer case and felt the cold of it through my jacket, through the folded resignation letter still sitting in my pocket, and I thought with a clarity that surprised me, this animal has been somewhere before it came here, and it is not finished yet. Polar bears have an olfactory system so sensitive they can detect a seal breathing through a meter of ice from more than a kilometer away. I had read this somewhere once years ago and filed it away in the category of facts that impress people at dinner parties without ever becoming genuinely useful. Standing 4 meters from one in a supermarket aisle, I suddenly understood what that statistic meant in practice. The bear had known exactly what was in this building long before it pushed through our doors. It had cataloged us, our smells, our positions, the particular chemical signature of human anxiety hanging in the refrigerated air, and it had made a decision. It had decided we were not the reason it had come. That realization moved through the room like a change in barometric pressure. I cannot explain how 9 people sharing no words arrived at the same understanding simultaneously. But we did. The bear was not confused. It was not trapped or panicked or behaving in any of the ways the emergency protocols had prepared us for. It knew where it was, and it knew where it was going. And the only question any of us could form, standing motionless in our respective aisles, barely breathing, was where exactly that was. Because the bear did not stop at the produce section, did not linger at the meat counter, did not investigate the bakery display that filled the entire front half of the store with a smell powerful enough to stop most humans at the door. It walked past all of it with the focused indifference of someone who already knows what they want and is tired of looking at things that are not it. Marte finally set the phone down. The soft plastic click of it meeting the counter was the only sound in the building, and the bear's head turned toward it instantly. Not aggressively, just with the automatic precision of an animal that processes all sensory information before deciding what requires a response. It determined, apparently, that the phone did not. It returned its gaze forward and kept walking. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 minutes, and the cold air from the freezer case tasted like the cleanest thing I had ever breathed. Here is what none of us said out loud, because none of us had the language for it yet. The bear was not behaving like an animal that had wandered into a human space by accident. There was no frantic scanning of exits, no explosive aggression born from the unbearable stress of confinement. None of the behaviors that wildlife officials describe in incident reports as the baseline response of a large predator disoriented by an enclosed environment. What the bear was doing, what I watched it do from 4 meters away with my back against a freezer and my hands shaking, looked disturbingly, inexplicably like a search, moving in a direction it had already chosen before it arrived. And the direction it had chosen was deeper into the store, toward the aisle at the far end of the building, where we kept the fish. The fish aisle in our store is the last one before the rear wall. It runs the full width of the building, maybe 12 meters, and it is refrigerated on both sides, open cases on the left displaying whole fish on crushed ice, sealed packages on the right stacked in precise rows that the night crew restocks before dawn. The smell is clean and cold and specific, in the way that only the smell of Arctic fish can be, carrying something of the sea in it. Even here, even under fluorescent lights, even 400 kilometers from the Norwegian mainland. That is where the bear was going. And when it arrived, it stopped, and it began to work. I had moved without deciding to move. Somewhere between aisle 2 and aisle 4, I had drifted toward the rear of the store, keeping parallel to the bear at a distance. I can only describe as the distance your body negotiates for you when your brain is no longer in charge of the calculation. I ended up crouched behind the corner of a refrigerated display case at the entrance to the fish aisle, close enough to hear the bear breathe, a slow, deep rhythm that sounded almost meditative, like something that had learned a long time ago that panic wastes more energy than it saves. I could see the full length of it from that angle. The massive shoulders, the neck thick as a tree trunk, The pale fur yellowed slightly at the underbelly, the way old ivory yellows, and above the left eye, catching the cold light one more time, the scar. It went to the open cases first. It lowered its head over the crushed ice and inhaled in a long, slow pull that ruffled the paper price tags at the edge of the display. It moved from left to right along the case, evaluating each section with a thoroughness that I can only call systematic, not random sniffing. Not the frenzied investigation of a hungry animal, but something that looked closer to assessment. It passed over the cod without pausing. It paused briefly at the Arctic char and then moved on. It stopped completely in front of the section where we kept the ringed seal portions, the ones we sourced from local hunters and sold primarily to the older residents who still cooked the way their grandparents had. It stood there for a long moment, very still, its breath fogging in the cold air of the display case, and something in the quality of that stillness made the hair on my arms stand up inside my jacket. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it matters for what comes later. It was not fear, or not only fear. It was the specific discomfort of watching something intelligent do something you do not yet understand. The bear was not eating. It had not touched a single item in the display case. It was smelling deeply, carefully, the way a person reads a letter they have already read before, looking for the line they know is there but cannot immediately find. I had worked with fish long enough to know that smell carries information, freshness, origin, the particular marine signature of different species in different waters. What I did not know, crouched behind that display case with my hands pressed flat against the cold floor, was what specific information this animal was looking for, or whether it had found it yet. Then it did something that I have described to at least 20 people since that day, and every single time I describe it, they look at me the way people look at someone who is either telling the truth about something impossible or lying about something ordinary. The bear lifted its head from the display case, turned away from the open fish section entirely, and walked to the sealed packages on the opposite side of the aisle. It lowered its nose to the lowest shelf, where we kept the vacuum-packed portions of bearded seal, a product we rarely sold, stocked mostly as a gesture toward the older hunting families in the community who still requested it. It pressed its nose against one of the packages, not hard enough to puncture it, just enough to hold contact. And then it held that position for so long that my knees began to ache against the floor, and I forgot entirely that there was a resignation letter folded in my jacket pocket. Bearded seals are the primary prey of polar bears across the Svalbard archipelago. A mature male can consume the blubber of a single bearded seal and sustain itself for nearly 2 weeks without eating again. I knew this the way you know things you've read on signs and information boards without ever expecting them to become relevant. What I did not know, what no sign had ever told me, was that polar bears can distinguish the scent of a specific seal's body composition from others of the same species. The way a person can sometimes recognize a voice before they recognize a face. The wildlife researcher who told me this, weeks after the incident, said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting weather data. But standing in that aisle, watching the bear hold its nose against a vacuum-sealed package on the bottom shelf of a supermarket in Longyearbyen, I did not have the benefit of that explanation. What I had was the growing inarticulate certainty that this animal had not wandered in here by accident, had not followed the general smell of fish through an open door, had not chosen our store at random from all the possible directions the tundra offers. It had come here looking for something specific. And whatever that thing was, I was beginning to understand, with a slowness that felt like ice breaking, it was connected to that scar above its eye, in a way I could not yet name. The bear lifted its nose from the vacuum-sealed package, straightened its enormous head, and stood still for a moment that lasted longer than any moment has a right to last. I watched it from behind the display case, my knees cold against the floor tiles, my breath shallow and controlled in the deliberate way you breathe when you're trying to make as little noise as possible. The fluorescent lights hummed above us both. The refrigeration units along the wall clicked and cycled. And then the bear turned around, slowly and completely, the way something turns when it has finished what it came to do, and began walking back toward the entrance. It passed me at a distance of less than 3 meters. I know this because I measured it afterward, walking the same path with my arms slightly extended, feeling the particular quality of that empty space where something enormous had recently been. At the moment it happened, I was not thinking about distance. I was pressed against the side of the display case, not breathing at all now, watching the bear's profile as it moved past. The slope of the skull, the thickness of the neck, the rhythmic rise and fall of those massive shoulders, and the scar above the left eye passing through my field of vision, like a slow comet, and then disappearing behind me as the bear continued forward. It did not look at me. I do not know if that made it better or worse. The 9 of us were still distributed across the store in the positions we had taken when the bear first entered, like figures in a painting no one had planned. Marte at the customer service counter. The teenager near the drinks. The man in the red jacket near the back wall who had not moved a centimeter in what must have been close to 8 minutes. The bear passed each of them on its return path with the same deliberate indifference it had shown coming in. Its gaze forward, its pace unchanged. Not a single display was disturbed. Not one item had been knocked from a shelf. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the long, slow fog of cold breath the bear had left hanging in the fish aisle, already dissolving in the recycled air. And that is when it happened. Not the thing with the bear, but the other thing, the thing I have been circling since I started telling the story. The bear was almost at the automatic doors when I felt it, a loosening in my chest that had nothing to do with relief that the animal was leaving. It was something older than that, something that had been tightening in me for months without my being able to name it, and it released all at once in the cold air of that supermarket aisle, like a knot finally finding the end of its rope. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the folded letter there, and I understood with a completeness that embarrassed me with its simplicity that I did not want to give this place up. I had confused exhaustion with certainty. I had been so tired that I had mistaken the weight of belonging somewhere for the weight of being trapped. I know how that sounds. I know that realizing you don't want to quit your job because a polar bear walked past you in a supermarket is not the kind of epiphany that impresses anyone when you describe it at dinner. But you have to understand what the bear had shown us in those 8 minutes, without trying to show us anything at all. It had moved through a space full of frightened humans with a composure so complete it bordered on grace. It had not reacted to our fear. It had not been diminished by the strangeness of its own situation. This apex predator of the high Arctic, navigating frozen food sections and fluorescent lighting and the ambient smell of commercial cleaning products. It had simply remained what it was, with a consistency so absolute it made everything else in the room look provisional by comparison. And something about witnessing that, about being in the physical presence of a creature that did not waver, broke something open in me that I had not known was sealed. The resignation letter was still in my pocket. I did not tear it up dramatically. I did not make any gesture at all. I simply stood up from behind the display case, slowly, and watched the bear reach the automatic doors, which slid open for it with the same mechanical indifference they extended to every customer. And I felt the cold air push into the store one final time, as 600 pounds of Arctic predators stepped through and disappeared into the gray Svalbard morning. The doors slid closed behind it. The refrigeration units hummed. Somewhere near the bread display, a woman exhaled, a long shaking breath that carried everything the rest of us had also been holding. And then the teenager by the drinks case did something I will remember for a long time. He reached out, opened the refrigerator door, and quietly took the bottle he had come for, as if the most important thing now was to finish what he had started. I was the first one to go outside. I don't know why it was me and not someone else, not Marte, who had more authority, not the man in the red jacket who was closer to the door. I think it was because I had something unfinished between me and that animal, some accounting that hadn't been settled yet, and my body understood this before my mind caught up. I pushed through the glass door into the cold Svalbard morning and stopped on the top step of the entrance, and there it was, the bear, 40 meters away in the middle of the parking lot, lying down on the asphalt with its chin resting on its front paws, the way a dog lies down when it has decided that wherever it is happens to be good enough. It was not panting. It was not scanning the tree line or testing the wind or performing any of the behaviors you would expect from a large predator in an exposed position in a human settlement. It was simply resting, with a stillness that seemed to belong to a different time scale than the one the rest of us operated on, patient in the way that glaciers are patient, in the way that the Arctic itself is patient, indifferent to the urgency of smaller, warmer things. The flat gray sky sat above it like a lid. The mountains across the fjord were dark and close, and the bear lay in the parking lot of a supermarket in Longyearbyen and did not seem to find this unreasonable. I sat down on the top step and looked at it for a long time. Behind me, I could hear the others gathering at the glass doors, the soft sounds of people who have shared something they don't yet have words for and are reluctant to break the spell with ordinary conversation. No one came out to join me. I was glad for that. The cold worked its way through my jacket and I let it, and I watched the bear breathe, the slow rise and fall of those enormous ribs, the fog of each exhale drifting upward and dissolving, and I reached into my pocket and took out the resignation letter and held it in both hands without doing anything with it yet. The wildlife researcher called it a behavior pattern they had been documenting for several years across the archipelago. Large males, typically older animals with established territories, making periodic visits to the edges of human settlements during periods of reduced sea ice when their normal hunting grounds became inaccessible. Not aggressive incursions, not desperate intrusions driven by starvation. Exploratory passes, she called them, conducted with a risk assessment so sophisticated it consistently surprised the researchers who studied them. The bears that did this were invariably the oldest, the most experienced animals that had accumulated enough information about human behavior to make calibrated decisions about proximity. Animals that had learned over many years and many careful observations exactly how close was close enough. She told me the bear's name, the designation the research team used, and she told me how old it was. 17 years, which is deep middle age for a wild polar bear, old enough to carry the kind of history that leaves marks. She told me the scar above its left eye was from an encounter with another male, 12 years prior during a territorial dispute on the sea ice east of the archipelago. She told me the bear had been tagged and tracked for 9 years, and that in those 9 years it had made contact with human settlements on 4 separate occasions, always brief, always non-aggressive, always concluded on the bear's own terms. She told me all of this in the flat, careful language of scientific documentation, and I listened and took notes and thanked her. And then I sat in my car in the parking lot of the same supermarket and understood for the first time what I had actually been watching from behind that display case. The bear had not come into the store because it was lost. It had not come in because it was starving or confused or driven by some failure of its natural instincts in the face of a changing world. It had come in because it was curious, and because 17 years of surviving the most unforgiving landscape on Earth had given it the confidence to act on that curiosity without being destroyed by it. It had walked through our door, assessed our fish aisle with the methodical attention of an expert, found what it was looking for, or confirmed what it already suspected, and left without taking anything, and without harming anyone, because taking and harming were not what it had come to do. It had come to know something, and knowing it was enough. I tore the resignation letter up that afternoon. Not dramatically. I didn't stand in the parking lot and release the pieces into the wind. I folded it once more and tore it in half and put it in the recycling bin behind the customer service counter, the one we used for cardboard and paper packaging. It felt like the right container for it. Marte saw me do it and didn't ask, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about her. I finished my shift, restocked the frozen goods section, and drove home along the coast road with the fjord running dark and cold beside me and the mountains holding their positions on the other side of the water. The same as always, the same as they would be tomorrow. The bear was gone from the parking lot by early afternoon. The wildlife team tracked it moving northeast along the coast, back toward the sea ice, unhurried. It did not return to town that season. But the scar above its left eye, that pale crescent I had noticed before I noticed anything else. In the first impossible second when 600 pounds of Arctic predator walked through our automatic doors, I have thought about it almost every day since, not because it was dramatic or because it changed the story. Because I saw it first and understood it last. And that, I have come to believe, is how the most important things always arrive. Visible from the beginning, legible only at the end.